There's a coin in the British Museum that tells you everything you need to know about how empires die. It's a Roman denarius from 64 AD under Emperor Nero. Pure silver. Beautiful. Worth a day's wages for a legionnaire. Next to it sits another denarius from 268 AD, just 200 years later, under Emperor Claudius II. Same name. Same face value. But when you test it, it's 95% copper with a thin silver wash. The Romans called it a denarius. The soldiers who were paid with it knew the truth. They'd been robbed. Between those two coins lies the story of how the greatest empire in human history destroyed itself. Not through barbarian invasion, not through military defeat, through inflation, through the systematic debasement of their currency, through the economic decisions that every failing empire makes when it can't afford its promises anymore. And here's what should terrify you about this story. The Romans knew exactly what they were doing. They understood the consequences, and they did it anyway because the alternative was admitting the empire was over. Sound familiar? This is the story of Rome's 200-year inflation crisis, how it destroyed the greatest civilization the world had ever seen, and why every empire that's tried the same thing since has ended the same way. Let's start at the peak. The Golden Age, 27 BC to 180 AD. Augustus Caesar, the first emperor, created something unprecedented. A currency system that worked for 200 years. The denarius was the dollar of the ancient world, made of 90% pure silver, standardized weight, accepted from Britain to Egypt, from Spain to Syria. Roman soldiers were paid in denarii, merchants calculated in denarii, taxes were collected in denarii, and because it held its value, the Roman economy flourished. Trade exploded. Cities grew. Infrastructure expanded. Aqueducts, roads, forums, amphitheaters. The Romans built things that still stand 2,000 years later because they had a stable currency that allowed long-term planning. When money holds value, people invest. When money holds value, people save. When money holds value, civilization advances. Rome at its peak had 60 million people, controlled 2.3 million square miles, generated 25% of global GDP. The Roman Empire wasn't just powerful, it was rich. Genuinely, productively, sustainably rich. But empires don't collapse at their peak. They collapse when they try to maintain the peak after the foundation has already cracked. And for Rome, the cracks started appearing around 180 AD when Marcus Aurelius died and left the empire to his son Commodus, because that's when Rome stopped expanding. The problem, empire without conquest. Here's what people don't understand about the Roman economy. It wasn't built on trade or innovation or production. It was built on conquest. Every time Rome conquered a new territory, they seized the wealth. Gold, silver, slaves, land, everything. That wealth funded the empire, paid the soldiers, built the cities, financed the government. But by 180 AD, Rome had conquered everything worth conquering. The borders were set. The expansion was over. And suddenly the economic model broke. Because now, instead of conquering and extracting wealth, Rome had to defend what it already had. The legions that used to pay for themselves through plunder now had to be paid from the treasury. The borders that kept expanding now had to be garrisoned permanently. The wealth that used to flow in from conquest now had to be generated internally. And Rome wasn't ready for that transition. The expenses kept growing. 30 legions on the frontier, 150,000 soldiers, plus auxiliaries, plus veterans' pensions, plus the Praetorian Guard, plus the Roman mob that had to be kept fed and entertained with bread and circuses. The costs were staggering, and the revenue wasn't keeping up. So the emperors had a choice. Raise taxes and risk rebellion. Cut spending and watch the borders collapse. Or debase the currency and create inflation. They chose inflation every single time. Because inflation is the coward's way out. It's a hidden tax. The emperor doesn't have to announce it. He just makes the coin slightly less pure. And most people don't notice until it's too late. Stage 1, the debasement begins, 180-235 AD. Commodus, the son of Marcus Aurelius, was the first to really debase the currency. When he took power in 180 AD, the denarius was still 80% silver. By the time he died in 192 AD, it was down to 75%. That doesn't sound like much, but it set the precedent. The sacred currency, the foundation of Roman prosperity, could be tampered with. His successors continued. Septimius Severus debased it further. Caracalla debased it further. Each emperor took the silver content down another few percentage points. Each time they promised it was temporary. Each time they said they had no choice. And each time prices rose a little higher. By 235 AD, the denarius was barely 50% silver. Half the coin was copper. And here's the insidious thing about inflation: it starts slowly, so slowly that people adapt. Merchants raise prices, workers demand higher wages, everyone adjusts, and the economy keeps functioning, barely. But you can't half inflate. Once you start, you can't stop, because the problems that caused you to inflate are still there. The borders still need defending, the soldiers still need paying, the mob still needs feeding, but now you need even more money because prices have risen. So you debase more, and prices rise more, and you debase more, and the spiral begins. Stage 2, the crisis of the 3rd century, 235-284 AD. This is when everything fell apart. In 235 AD, Emperor Alexander Severus was murdered by his own troops. Over the next 50 years, Rome had over 50 emperors. Most lasted less than a year. Most were murdered by rivals or their own soldiers. Why? Because the soldiers weren't being paid enough. Their wages were fixed, but inflation was destroying the value of those wages. A legionnaire in 200 AD was paid 300 denarii per year. By 250 AD, he was still paid 300 denarii per year, but those denarii bought half as much. The soldier had been given a 50% pay cut through inflation. So what did soldiers do? They murdered emperors and declared their own generals emperor, hoping for a bonus. Civil war became permanent, and civil war meant more military spending, which meant more debasement, which meant more inflation. By 268 AD, the denarius was less than 5% silver. That coin in the British Museum I mentioned at the start. Copper with silver plating. And the economy was dying. Why plant crops when currency is worthless? Why trade when you don't know what money will be worth next month? Why invest in anything long-term when the future is chaos? Roman agriculture collapsed. Trade collapsed. Cities shrank. The population fell. Not from plague or invasion, from economic destruction. The empire was eating itself. Stage 3, hyperinflation and the Antoninianus disaster. The denarius became so debased that people stopped accepting it. So Emperor Caracalla introduced a new coin in 215 AD, the Antoninianus. Supposedly worth 2 denarii. Made of better silver at first, but the pattern repeated. As soon as the government controlled a new currency, they debased it. By 260 AD, the Antoninianus was down to 5% silver. By 270 AD, less than 2%. It was bronze painted silver, a fraud so obvious that merchants rejected it outright. Prices exploded. We have records from Egypt. In 200 AD, a measure of wheat cost half a denarius. By 300 AD, the same wheat cost 200 denarii. A 400 times increase in 100 years. That's hyperinflation. And it destroyed everything. People stopped using money entirely. They went back to barter. Taxes had to be collected in grain and goods because currency was worthless. The sophisticated monetary economy that had built Rome collapsed back into primitive exchange. The empire still existed on paper, but economically it was dead. Stage 4, Diocletian's price controls, 284 AD. When Diocletian became emperor in 284 AD, he tried to fix the crisis. But he didn't fix the cause. He tried to fix the symptoms. In 301 AD, he issued the Edict on Maximum Prices, a price control decree that set legal maximum prices for over 1,000 goods and services. Wages were capped. Prices were capped. Violators faced the death penalty. The Romans thought inflation was caused by greedy merchants, so they just forced prices down by law. This is what every failing government does when inflation spirals. They blame greed instead of currency debasement. They impose controls instead of fixing the money, and it never works. Because price controls don't address the underlying problem. There's too much money chasing too few goods. Making it illegal to charge market prices doesn't change that. It just drives trade underground. Within months, goods disappeared from markets. Why sell at controlled prices when you lose money on every sale? Farmers stopped bringing food to cities. Merchants stopped trading. The black market exploded. Diocletian's price controls accelerated the economic collapse they were supposed to prevent. The edict was quietly abandoned within a few years, but the damage was done. Stage 5, the final debasement and fall, 300–476 AD. Constantine tried to stabilize things in 312 AD by introducing a new gold coin, the solidus. Finally, a currency that held value. But gold coins didn't help common people. Only the wealthy and the government used them. Everyone else was still stuck with debased bronze coins worth nothing. The Roman economy split into two tiers. The elite used gold. The masses used worthless copper. Social cohesion disintegrated. The tax base collapsed. Because when currency is worthless, no one can pay taxes in currency. Rome had to extract taxes in kind, sending soldiers to farms to seize grain directly, which looked exactly like barbarian raids. So why defend the empire? The farmers couldn't tell the difference between the Roman government and the invaders anymore. Both just took their food. By 400 AD, Roman legions were being paid in land grants instead of money, because money meant nothing. The professional army that had conquered the world became a feudal militia. The provinces that had been integrated into a single economy fragmented into isolated regions. The roads fell into disrepair because no one could afford maintenance. The cities emptied as people fled to self-sufficient rural estates. The Western Roman Empire in 450 AD looked nothing like the empire in 150 AD. Same name, same government, technically, but it was a hollow shell. When the Visigoths sacked Rome in 410 AD, it was barely news. When the last Western emperor was deposed in 476 AD, almost no one noticed, because the empire had been economically dead for over a century. The formal end was just paperwork. The pattern: why inflation always destroys empires. Here's what Rome teaches us. Currency debasement isn't just an economic policy, it's suicide. Because money is trust. When the government systematically destroys that trust, everything built on that trust collapses. Trade requires trust. Investment requires trust. Social cohesion requires trust. Long-term thinking requires trust. When money loses value, all of that disappears. And the insidious part is that it happens slowly enough that each step seems reasonable. We just need to debase the currency a little bit to pay the soldiers. Just a little bit more to defend the borders. Just a little more to avoid collapse. Each step is justified. Each step is necessary. But the steps add up. 10% silver removed becomes 20%, then 50%, then 95%. And once you're on that path, there's no way back. Because the problems that cause debasement keep growing. Rome needed money to defend the empire. But debasement caused inflation. Inflation impoverished the provinces. Impoverished provinces generated less tax revenue. Less revenue meant more need to debase. More debasement meant more inflation. It's a death spiral, and every empire that's tried it has ended the same way. Spain debased their currency, collapsed. Britain inflated through world wars, lost the empire. The Soviet Union printed rubles no one wanted, disintegrated. Weimar Germany hyperinflated, destroyed. Zimbabwe printed trillion-dollar notes, failed. Venezuela inflated to survive, collapsed. The pattern is universal. The pattern is mathematical. You cannot maintain empire through currency debasement. You cannot print your way to prosperity. You cannot inflate away your problems. All you do is destroy the economic foundation everything else rests on.